The air in Breckinridge County, Kentucky, in the autumn of 1871 was thick with the scent of wood smoke and decay. It was a familiar smell for the season, a time when the world was dying beautifully, all crimson and gold. But on the morning of October 23rd, as Sheriff Brody Mullins rode his horse up the long, muddy track to the Miller farm, a different smell tainted the air. It was a cloying, greasy sweetness, something like pork but with a deeper, gamier note that made the saliva in his mouth turn sour. It clung to the damp trees and settled in the back of his throat, a premonition of some profound wrongness. The farmhouse itself was silent. No dogs barked a welcome, no chickens scattered from the horse's path. The silence was heavier, more complete than the simple absence of sound. It was an oppressive, listening silence, as if the very clapboard walls of the small home were holding their breath. Sheriff Mullins dismounted, his boots sinking into the muck. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging on a single rusted hinge. He called out, "Sarah Jane, Thomas, anyone home?" Only the wind answered, whispering through the broken pane of a nearby window. He pushed the door open, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. The smell was stronger inside, a thick, almost visible vapor emanating from the hearth. There, over a low-burning fire, a large cast-iron pot bubbled away, its contents shrouded in steam. And sitting in a rocking chair beside it, staring into the flames with vacant, unblinking eyes, was Sarah Jane Miller. She rocked back and forth with a slow, metronomic rhythm, a wooden spoon held loosely in her lap. She didn't seem to notice him. She just rocked and stared as the forbidden stew simmered. Sheriff Mullins cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. "Sarah Jane," he repeated, stepping fully into the small, one-room cabin. "It's Sheriff Mullins. We had a report your neighbor, Mr. Abernathy. He said he ain't seen Thomas or the children in over a week." Sarah Jane's rocking didn't falter. Her gaze remained fixed on the fire, a faint, almost beatific smile playing on her lips. The cabin was tidy, unnaturally so. The dirt floor was swept clean, the meager furniture dusted. A stack of neatly folded children's clothes sat on a small trunk in the corner. It was a scene of domestic order that stood in horrifying contrast to the palpable dread that filled the room. The sheriff took another step, his eyes drawn back to the bubbling pot. The aroma was sickening now, a grotesque perversion of a comforting meal. He could see chunks of pale meat mingling with carrots and potatoes, slick with a thick, fatty broth. "Sarah Jane, where are the children?" he asked, his voice firm but laced with a growing unease. "Where's little Samuel and Martha?" For the first time she stirred. Her head turned slowly, her movements sluggish as if moving through deep water. Her eyes, when they finally met his, were a placid, terrifying blue. They were the eyes of someone who had traveled to a very distant place and had only just returned, leaving part of their soul behind. "They're safe now," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "They won't ever be hungry again, they won't ever cry again." She gestured with her chin toward the pot. "Supper's almost ready, Sheriff. You're just in time." A cold knot of pure horror tightened in Mullins's stomach. He understood. He didn't want to, but in that single, macabre moment, he understood. To comprehend the darkness that fell upon the Miller farm, one must first understand the land itself. Post-Civil War Kentucky was a haunted place, a border state torn asunder by loyalties and loss. The bluegrass hills and deep, shadowed hollows were soaked in blood and bitterness. Reconstruction was a word spoken with a sneer in these parts, a promise of northern interference that never quite materialized into prosperity. For small-time farmers like Thomas and Sarah Jane Miller, life was a relentless grind, a daily battle waged against stubborn soil, unpredictable weather, and the crushing weight of poverty. They had settled on a 100-acre plot of marginal land, nestled in a remote creek valley that locals called Witch's Cradle. The name was ancient, its origins lost to time, but the folklore remained. They said the soil there was soured by something older than the war, that the creek water ran unnaturally cold even in the height of summer, and that things sometimes vanished without a trace: a calf, a tool, a child who wandered too far from the porch. The Millers were outsiders, having moved from Tennessee a few years prior, seeking a fresh start they would never find. They were seen as quiet, insular folk. Thomas was a hard worker, a man broken by the war but not his will. Sarah Jane was even quieter, a wraith-like figure rarely seen in the nearby town of Hardinsburg. Neighbors whispered that she had a fragile constitution, that she was prone to long spells of melancholy where she would sit and stare at the wall for hours, speaking to no one. They were a family living on the edge of the world, both geographically and psychologically, forgotten by progress and left to fester in their own isolation. The year 1871 had been particularly cruel. A late spring frost killed the early corn and a summer drought withered what was left. The creek in Witch's Cradle slowed to a muddy trickle. Game became scarce, and the specter of starvation, a familiar ghost in these Appalachian foothills, began to loom large over the Miller cabin. Thomas grew gaunt and grim, his face a mask of desperation. He took to leaving for days at a time, hunting deeper in the woods or seeking day labor in towns further east, leaving Sarah Jane alone with their two young children, 8-year-old Samuel and 6-year-old Martha. It was this isolation that seemed to prey upon her most. The nearest neighbor, the Abernathy farm, was over 2 miles away, a journey through dense, unforgiving woods. Days would blend into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a merciless sun. Sarah Jane's world shrank until it was composed of only 3 things: the suffocating cabin, the 2 hungry mouths she had to feed, and the unnerving silence of the surrounding forest. Mr. Abernathy would later report to the sheriff that he had seen Sarah Jane wandering the edges of her property at odd hours, talking to herself. He said she claimed the trees were whispering to her, telling her secrets about a coming winter that would be the last winter, a time of great and terrible cleansing. He had dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely, overwrought woman. He had no way of knowing he was witnessing the slow, horrifying unraveling of a human mind, a mind being poisoned by solitude, hunger, and the dark, ancient superstitions that clung to that forsaken piece of land like morning fog. The children, Samuel and Martha, were by all accounts quiet and withdrawn, miniatures of their parents. They were rarely seen playing. Instead, they were often observed sitting on the porch steps, watching the tree line with a solemn intensity, as if waiting for something to emerge. A traveling preacher who had stopped at the farm that summer to offer a blessing and water his horse later recalled the disturbing vacancy in their eyes. He described them as old souls in young bodies, children who seemed to carry the weight of their family's hardship in their small, slumped shoulders. He noted that their mother, Sarah Jane, barely spoke a word to him but watched her children with a possessive, almost predatory focus that he found deeply unsettling. He tried to offer her a Bible, but she refused it, stating calmly that God left this holler a long time ago. This anecdote, shared weeks later, would form another piece of the Macabre puzzle. It painted a picture not just of poverty, but of a profound spiritual desolation. The family was cut off from everything, from community, from prosperity, and from faith. They were an island of despair in a sea of hardship. This isolation created a closed system, a pressure cooker of misery and madness where dark thoughts could take root and flourish, unchecked by the outside world. The whispers of the trees that Sarah Jane heard might not have been real, but the silence that allowed her to hear them most certainly was. It was a silence that would soon be broken by an act of unimaginable horror. The last confirmed sighting of Thomas Miller alive was on October 12th. He was seen leaving the general store in Hardinsburg with a small sack of flour and some salt, hardly enough to sustain a family for more than a few days. He looked haggard, according to the store owner, and spoke of heading east to look for work on the new railroad lines, a desperate gamble for many men in the region. He said he would be gone for a week, maybe 2. He never mentioned any trouble at home, but there was a deep-set weariness in his eyes, the look of a man carrying a burden heavier than any sack of flour. After that day, Thomas Miller simply vanished. No one on the railroad lines ever saw him. No one in the neighboring towns recalled a man matching his description. He walked out of that general store and into the pages of a forbidden history, leaving his wife and 2 small children to face the encroaching winter alone in their cursed hollow. His disappearance was the catalyst. Whatever tenuous grip on reality Sarah Jane still possessed seemed to snap in his absence. The sole provider, the buffer between her and the abyss, was gone. She was now truly alone with the children, the hunger, and the whispering woods. The boundary between protector and predator began to dissolve. The days that followed are a black hole in the historical record, a period of horrifying transformation that can only be pieced together through conjecture and the chilling physical evidence that would later be discovered. What happened in that cabin between October 12th and October 23rd is the stuff of nightmares, a descent into a primeval madness that rejected every sacred law of nature and humanity. It was old Jedediah Abernathy who finally broke the spell of silence around the Miller farm. He had grown increasingly worried. The usual signs of life, a cloud of smoke from the chimney in the morning, the sound of an axe splitting wood, the distant cries of children had all ceased. For 3 days the farm had been deathly still. On the 4th day he couldn't bear the knot of anxiety in his gut any longer. He walked the 2 miles through the woods, calling their names as he approached. The silence that answered him back was absolute and profound. He found the cabin as Sheriff Mullins would later find it, the door ajar, the interior unnervingly tidy, and a strange, sweet smell hanging in the air. But there was no one there. The pot on the hearth was cold, its contents a congealed, greasy mess. Sarah Jane and the children were gone. Fearing the worst, perhaps a violent robbery, or that the family had simply starved to death, Abernathy rode the 10 miles to Hardinsburg to fetch the sheriff. He didn't know it, but he had stumbled upon the scene of a crime, yet the perpetrator and the victims had all seemingly vanished. The cabin was not just a home, it was a stage meticulously set and then abandoned. This initial discovery only deepened the mystery. Where had Sarah Jane gone? And more importantly, where were her children? The neatly folded clothes on the trunk seemed to suggest a planned departure, yet the simmering pot on the hearth suggested an interruption. The contradictions were maddening, and they were only the beginning of a truly disturbing cold case. The story of the farmer's wife who cooked her children was about to begin, but first, it was a story of a family that had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. Sheriff Mullins organized a small search party the next day. 4 men, including Abernathy, set out to comb the woods surrounding the Miller property. They were looking for any sign, tracks, a piece of torn clothing, a makeshift grave. They found nothing. It was as if the family had been spirited away by the morning mist. The woods around Witch's Cradle were notoriously dense and labyrinthine, a place where a man could get turned around and lost just a few hundred yards from his own home. But to find no trace of 3 people, 2 of them small children, was uncanny. As the day wore on with no success, a darker mood settled over the men. They began to speak in hushed tones of the old stories, the local legends about the Hollow. They spoke of the Taker, a folkloric entity said to snatch people who strayed too far into the deep woods, leaving nothing behind. These were ghost stories, tales told to frighten children, but in the oppressive silence of that forest, they felt chillingly plausible. The search party returned at dusk, empty-handed and unnerved. The Miller cabin sat dark and silent, a monument to a terrible mystery. The disappearance of the Millers was now the talk of Breckinridge County. Theories swirled like autumn leaves. They had been killed by rogue ex-soldiers, taken by Indians, or had simply packed up and left in the middle of the night to escape their debts. But none of these theories could explain the strange, tidy emptiness of the cabin or the pot of stew left on the hearth. The truth, as is often the case in these macabre histories, was far more horrifying than any fiction or folklore. And it was a truth that was about to walk right back into its own crime scene. 2 days later, Sarah Jane Miller returned. She was found by one of the sheriff's deputies, sitting on the porch of the cabin in her rocking chair, humming a soft, tuneless lullaby. She was wearing the same simple dress she always wore, but it was immaculately clean. Her hair was neatly combed, and her face held a serene, almost blissful expression. It was the same placid demeanor Sheriff Mullins would encounter when he arrived. When the deputy asked her where she had been, she simply smiled and said she'd been visiting with the old ones in the woods. When he asked about Thomas and the children, her smile never wavered. "They've gone on ahead," she said. "They've been delivered from their suffering." It was her calmness that was so deeply disturbing. There was no sign of grief, no panic, no distress. It was the calm of a storm's eye, a terrifying stillness that hinted at the destructive fury that must have preceded it. Her return, as sudden and inexplicable as her disappearance, turned the missing persons case into something far more sinister. She was not a victim, she was a suspect. But a suspect in what? With no bodies and no evidence of a struggle, there was no crime to charge her with. There was only the empty cabin, the missing husband and children, and a woman whose sanity seemed to have evaporated like dew in the morning sun. Her cryptic answers and beatific smile were a wall the law could not penetrate. Sheriff Mullins was now faced with a horrifying dilemma. He was almost certain this woman had done something terrible to her family, but he had absolutely no proof. The only witness was Sarah Jane herself, and she was lost in a world of her own making. It was the stew that held the secret. During the initial search, the cold, congealed contents of the pot had been noted but largely dismissed as spoiled food. But now, with Sarah Jane's return and her disturbing pronouncements, Sheriff Mullins looked at it with new eyes. He instructed his deputy to empty the pot's contents onto a piece of canvas behind the cabin. What they found would forever haunt the annals of Kentucky crime. Amidst the mushy carrots and potatoes, there were bones. They were small, delicate bones, clearly not from a rabbit or a squirrel. As the deputy carefully washed the grease away in a bucket of water, the shapes became horribly recognizable. There was the unmistakable curve of a small rib cage, a piece of a slender forearm, and then at the bottom of the pile a small human jawbone complete with a few tiny, milky white teeth. The deputy retched, stumbling back from the canvas. Sheriff Mullins stood frozen, the blood draining from his face. The sweet, sickly smell that had clung to the cabin for days suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. The whispers of the trees and the folklore of the taker paled in comparison to the tangible, undeniable evil laid bare on that canvas. This was not the work of a mythical beast or a wandering marauder. This was a domestic horror, a macabre act committed at the family hearth. The children had not vanished. They had been consumed. And the cook was sitting calmly on the front porch, humming a lullaby. The case of the missing Miller family had just become the case of the cannibal mother. The arrest of Sarah Jane Miller was a quiet, surreal affair. She offered no resistance. When Sheriff Mullins confronted her with the small bones, her serene expression didn't change. She simply nodded as if confirming a fact she already knew. "The flesh is weak," she said, her voice distant. "It must be rendered down so the spirit can be free." She was taken to the small county jail in Hardinsburg, a stone building that had seen its share of drunks and thieves, but never a monster of this magnitude. News of the discovery spread through the town like a plague. The initial mystery and concern for the missing family curdled into shock, revulsion, and a dark, prurient fascination. The story became a local legend overnight, a piece of forbidden folklore whispered over dinner tables and in taverns. The Miller farm in Witch's Cradle was now truly cursed land, not by spirits, but by the memory of an unthinkable act. The townsfolk couldn't reconcile the image of the quiet, withdrawn farmer's wife with the architect of such a grotesque crime. They searched their memories for signs, for warnings they had missed. Her melancholy spells, her odd, reclusive behavior, her supposed conversations with the trees, it all now seemed like a prelude to the inevitable eruption of madness. The community began to piece together a narrative of a woman driven insane by hardship and isolation, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the frontier. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that this was not a simple case of a mind snapping under pressure. There was a method to Sarah Jane's madness, a chilling logic that was perhaps more terrifying than the act itself. If you find these dives into the darker side of history compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. Every story we unearth is a journey into the shadows, and the tale of Sarah Jane Miller is about to lead us into the darkest corners of the human psyche. In the days following her arrest, Sarah Jane remained a placid enigma. She sat in her cell, humming the same tuneless lullaby, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the stone walls. She ate what little food she was given and slept soundly. She showed no remorse, no fear, no emotion at all. It was this unnerving tranquility that baffled investigators most. Dr. Alastair Finch, a physician from Louisville with an interest in the emerging field of mental maladies, was called in to assess her. He spent several hours with her, asking questions about her life, her husband, her children. Most of his questions were met with silence or with cryptic, rambling statements about the hunger of the woods and the need for a great sacrifice. She spoke of her children not as if they were dead, but as if they had undergone a transformation. "They are part of the soil now," she explained calmly. "They are in the trees and the water. They will not feel the cold of the coming winter." Dr. Finch was one of the first to use the term melancholia with religious mania, attempting to fit her horrifying actions into a medical framework. He theorized that years of isolation, malnutrition, and postpartum depression had created a perfect storm of psychosis. She had, in his opinion, created her own twisted theology, a folk religion where cannibalism was a form of sacred salvation, a way to deliver her children from a world of suffering she could no longer endure. Her motive, he concluded, was not malice, but a deeply perverted form of love. This diagnosis, while providing a semblance of an explanation, did little to lessen the horror. It only made it more intimate, more disturbingly human. While Sarah Jane was being evaluated, the question of her husband, Thomas, remained. Where was he in all of this? Was he a victim, or was he somehow complicit? A new, more thorough search of the Miller property was conducted. This time, the searchers knew they were looking for a body. They focused on the areas around the cabin, the small vegetable patch, the pigsty, the shallow well. For 2 days they dug, turning over the cursed soil of Witch's Cradle. On the 3rd day they found him. Thomas Miller was buried in a shallow grave beneath the floorboards of the woodshed, not 10 yards from the cabin door. He had been killed by a single, powerful blow to the back of the head, likely with the flat side of an axe. He had been dead for at least a week, perhaps longer, placing his death around the time he was last seen in town. This discovery shifted the entire narrative. Sarah Jane had not been a woman abandoned by her husband and driven to madness. She was a widow and likely a murderer twice over before she even turned on her own children. The killing of Thomas was different from the ritualistic horror of the stew. It was brutal, efficient, and clandestine. It spoke of a different kind of motivation, not a warped spiritual deliverance, but something more primal like rage or desperation. Had they fought? Had he threatened to leave them for good? Or was his death the first step in her horrifying plan, the removal of the final obstacle that tethered her to the rational world? The questions multiplied, each one darker than the last. Sarah Jane Miller was no longer just a mad woman. She was a cunning and brutally effective killer. The discovery of Thomas Miller's body sent a new wave of fear and fascination through Breckinridge County. The story was now a full-blown sensation, picked up by newspapers in Louisville and even as far as Cincinnati. They dubbed her the Kentucky Cannibal, a sensationalist moniker that sealed her fate in the public imagination. The details of the crime were laid bare for a shocked readership. The husband bludgeoned and buried, the children dismembered and cooked into a stew. It was a story that seemed to belong to the darkest medieval fairy tales, not the supposedly enlightened 19th century. Reporters flocked to Hardinsburg, eager for any scrap of information, interviewing neighbors, the sheriff, anyone who had ever had contact with the Miller family. They painted a picture of a brooding, silent woman, a family living in squalor and isolation, and a piece of land whispered to be cursed for generations. The folklore of Witch's Cradle was no longer just local superstition. It was now woven into the fabric of a national horror story. It provided a supernatural explanation for a crime that was otherwise too human, too terrible to comprehend. It was easier for people to believe that some ancient evil in the woods had possessed Sarah Jane than to accept that a mother, any mother, could be capable of such a monstrous act on her own. The cursed narrative became a comfort, a way to distance the crime from the realm of the possible and place it firmly in the category of the forbidden, the unnatural. But Sheriff Mullins and Dr. Finch knew that the evil was not in the soil or the trees. It was in the heart and mind of the woman sitting silently in her cell. Confronted with the evidence of her husband's murder, Sarah Jane's placid demeanor finally showed a crack. For a brief moment, a flicker of something, anger or perhaps fear, crossed her face. She refused to speak about Thomas at first, but after hours of quiet, persistent questioning by Dr. Finch, she finally broke her silence. Her account was delivered in the same detached, monotone voice, but the details were chillingly lucid. She claimed that Thomas had become a vessel of despair. He had spoken of abandoning the farm, of sending the children to an orphanage, of heading west alone to start a new life. He saw no hope, only the endless cycle of debt and starvation. The world had eaten his soul, Sarah Jane stated. He was already dead inside. I just helped the body catch up. She described how she had waited for him to fall asleep, then struck him with the wood-splitting axe. She recalled dragging his body to the woodshed and digging the grave with a small hand trowel, a task that took her the better part of 2 days. She spoke of it not as a murder, but as a chore, a necessary task like mending a fence or churning butter. There was no passion in her retelling, no rage or remorse. It was a cold, calculated act. She believed she was purging the house of a negative influence, a spiritual sickness that threatened to infect her and the children. With Thomas gone, she was free to enact her own, more radical solution to their suffering, a final, horrifying sacrament at the family hearth. The confession of her husband's murder added a new layer of calculated cruelty to Sarah Jane's crimes. It suggested a progression, a descent that began not with a sudden psychotic break, but with a conscious decision to eliminate a perceived obstacle. Dr. Finch began to revise his initial diagnosis. While he still believed she was suffering from a profound psychosis, he now saw a terrifying logic underpinning her actions. In her fractured mind, the world was a source of relentless suffering. Thomas, with his despair, was an agent of that world. By killing him, she was severing her last tie to it. She was creating a closed, sacred space within the cabin, a sanctuary where she held absolute power over life and death. The children were next. Her love for them had become so twisted, pathically that she could not bear the thought of them experiencing the same pain and despair that had consumed their father. Annihilation became an act of mercy. Death was not an end but a transfiguration. This was the core of her delusion. She wasn't destroying her family. She was saving them, preserving them in the only way she knew how. She would absorb them into herself, literally, making them a part of her body just as they had once been, shielding them from the horrors of the world forever. It was a philosophy of madness, born in the crucible of isolation and poverty, a terrifying testament to the mind's ability to construct its own reality, complete with its own moral code and its own forbidden rituals. The horror was not just what she did, but the meticulous, perverse reasoning she used to justify it. The trial of Sarah Jane Miller, held in the spring of 1872, was a spectacle. The small Breckinridge County courthouse was packed to the rafters every day. People came from all over the state, drawn by the macabre celebrity of the Kentucky cannibal. She sat silently at the defendant's table, showing no interest in the proceedings. Her defense attorney, a young, overwhelmed man appointed by the court, argued for insanity. He brought Dr. Finch to the test of length about Sarah Jane's psychosis, her religious delusions, and the brutal conditions that had likely contributed to her mental collapse. He argued that she was not morally responsible for her actions, that she was living in a reality entirely separate from our own. The prosecutor, however, painted a different picture. He portrayed her as a cold, calculating monster. He emphasized the premeditated murder of her husband, the methodical butchering of her children, and her cunning attempts to conceal her crimes by first feigning a disappearance. He presented the bones found in the stew as evidence, Exhibit A, B, and C, laying them out on a velvet cloth for the jury to see. He argued that while she may be mentally unwell, she understood the nature of her actions. She knew right from wrong, and she chose wrong. He demanded the gallows, arguing that such a creature could not be allowed to live, that her evil was a contagion that needed to be purged by the ultimate punishment. The jury, a panel of 12 local farmers and merchants, was trapped between these two horrifying narratives, the tragic madwoman and the inhuman monster. The most chilling testimony came from Sheriff Brody Mullins. He recounted the day he arrived at the cabin, describing the oppressive silence, the cloying smell from the pot, and the as she sat in her rocking chair. His voice, usually strong and steady, faltered as he described her words. "Supper's almost ready, Sheriff. You're just in time." A wave of revulsion washed over the courtroom. He then described the gruesome discovery of the bones on the canvas, his deputy physically sickening at the sight. He spoke of her complete lack of emotion during her arrest and interrogation. He told the jury that in his 20 years as a lawman, he had seen all manner of human depravity, but he had never encountered a coldness so absolute, a darkness so profound as the one he saw in Sarah Jane Miller's eyes. His testimony anchored the horror in reality, stripping away the sensationalism and leaving only the stark, unbearable truth. He wasn't describing a monster from folklore. He was describing his neighbor. This was the crux of the terror that gripped the community. If this could happen in the Miller cabin, it could happen anywhere. It suggested that the veil between civilization and savagery was terrifyingly thin, and that for some, it could be torn away by nothing more than hunger, loneliness, and a few whispered suggestions from the shadows of a troubled mind. The sheriff's words left the jury with a deeply unsettling question. Were they judging a woman, or were they passing sentence on a part of human nature they dared not acknowledge? During the trial, the details of the children's final days were pieced together from Sarah Jane's fragmented confessions to Dr. Finch. She claimed that after she had disposed of Thomas's body, she spent several days in a state of what she called quiet contemplation. She bathed the children, dressed them in their best clothes, and read to them from a tattered book of folk tales, not the Bible. She said they were happy in those final days, unaware of the fate she had planned for them. She told the doctor that the whispering from the woods had become louder, more insistent. It gave her instructions on Bud's sacrifice at the heart of the home. On the morning of October 21st, she told Samuel and Martha that they were going to play a new game, a game of deep sleep. She brewed a strong tea from wild roots and herbs she had gathered, a concoction that included nightshade and other sedatives. She gave it to the children to drink, telling them it would help them have sweet dreams. They drank it without protest, trusting their mother completely. As they drifted into a deep, unending sleep, she carried them to their bed. She sat with them for a long time, humming her tuneless lullaby until she was sure their small hearts had stopped beating. This methodical, almost tender process was, for many, the most disturbing part of the entire affair. It was a murder disguised as an act of maternal care, a poisoning presented as a loving ritual. What followed the poisoning was an act of such profound desecration that it tested the limits of language. In her confession, Sarah Jane described the process with the same chilling detachment she used for everything else. She carried the small bodies, one by one, to the large wooden table in the center of the room. She said she felt a sense of sacred purpose, as if she were a priestess preparing a holy sacrifice. Using a set of butcher knives that Thomas had used for slaughtering hogs, she performed a task for which there is no word. She worked through the night, by the light of a single flickering lantern. The details, which the prosecutor spared the jury but were recorded in Dr. Finch's private notes, are the stuff of absolute nightmare. She treated their bodies not as her children but as meat. She separated flesh from bone with a practiced, dispassionate efficiency. The parts she deemed impure she burned in the fireplace. The rest she placed in the large cast-iron stew pot, along with the last of their vegetables from the garden. She told Dr. Finch that as she stirred the pot, she felt a profound sense of peace wash over her for the first time in years. The hunger, both literal and spiritual, was finally being sated. She had created a new kind of communion, a horrifying Eucharist where she was the sole congregant and her children were the sacrament. She had not just killed them, She had unmade them, deconstructed them, reduced them from beloved children to mere ingredients in a forbidden recipe designed to save her soul. The story grows darker with every revelation. If you have the stomach to continue this journey into one of America's most macabre cold cases, be sure to like this video and subscribe. The final verdict and Sarah Jane's ultimate fate are yet to come. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes self-admitted. The only real question was her sanity. Could a sane person commit such acts? But in the 19th century, the legal definition of insanity was narrow. The question was not whether she was mentally ill, but whether she understood that her actions were wrong in the eyes of society and God. The prosecution had argued successfully that her attempts to hide Thomas's body and her initial disappearance after the crime proved she knew she had broken the law. The jury agreed. They found her guilty on all counts, 2 counts of murder for her children and 1 for her husband. However, they stopped short of recommending the death penalty. In a rare act of judicial ambivalence, they attached a recommendation for mercy to their verdict, citing the unfortunate circumstances and the deranged state of the defendant's mind. They convicted a monster, but they seemed unwilling to hang a madwoman. This verdict satisfied no one. For those who saw her as a creature of pure evil, it was a miscarriage of justice. For those who saw her as a tragic victim of psychosis, the guilty verdict was a failure of compassion and understanding. She was to be sentenced to life imprisonment, but where could such a person be held? The local jail was insufficient, and the state penitentiary was not equipped to handle a case of her unique psychological fragility and notoriety. Sarah Jane Miller had become a problem that the legal and medical systems of her time were utterly unprepared to solve. In the end, a compromise was reached. Sarah Jane Miller would not be sent to the gallows, nor would she be sent to a standard prison. She was committed to the Western Kentucky Lunatic Asylum in Hopkinsville, a place that was, in itself, a house of horrors. Asylums of that era were not places of healing. They were human warehouses, dumping grounds for society's unwanted, the mentally ill, the indigent, and the inconvenient. Conditions were often brutal, with patients subjected to cruel and experimental treatments ranging from ice baths and electroshock to lobotomies. Sarah Jane vanished behind its high brick walls, her name fading from the sensationalist headlines and passing into the realm of dark legend. Reports from within the asylum are scarce and unreliable. Some records suggest she spent the rest of her days in a state of near catatonic silence, sitting in a chair and staring at a wall, much as she had done in her cabin. Other, more apocryphal tales claim she retained her chilling lucidity, sometimes whispering to other inmates about her sacred recipes and the sweetness of deliverance. One unsubstantiated story claims that she developed a reputation as a prophetess among the other patients, who would seek her out for her cryptic, often terrifying, predictions. Whatever the truth, she never showed a shred of remorse for her actions. To her dying day, it is believed she was convinced that she had done the right thing, that she had performed a great and terrible act of love. She died of tuberculosis in the asylum 24 years later, in 1896, and was buried in an unmarked grave on the institution's grounds, her dark secrets buried with her. And what of the farm in Witch's Cradle? After the trial, no one would go near it. The property was seized by the county for non-payment of taxes but could not be sold. No one wanted to live on land so profoundly stained by horror. The cabin was left to rot, a silent monument to the Miller family's tragedy. Locals claimed that a palpable aura of sorrow and malevolence clung to the place. Hunters who strayed too close reported hearing a woman humming a lullaby on the wind, or the faint, ghostly cries of children. Some even claimed to see a faint light moving in the cabin's broken windows on moonless nights. Within a few years, the roof of the cabin collapsed under the weight of winter snow. The walls buckled and fell, and the forest began the slow process of reclaiming the land. The woodshed where Thomas was buried rotted into the ground. The hearth where the forbidden stew was cooked became a pile of crumbling stones, overgrown with poison ivy. Today, the exact location of the Miller farm is lost to time. Local historians believe it lies somewhere in the deep woods of what is now the Rough River Lake State Resort Park. There is no plaque, no marker, no sign that anything ever happened there. The land keeps its secrets. But the story persists, a banned piece of local history, a ghost story told around campfires, a warning about the darkness that can bloom in the lonely places of the world. The curse of the Miller farm was not supernatural. It was the indelible memory of a crime so monstrous it permanently poisoned the soil on which it was committed. The story of Sarah Jane Miller raises questions that linger long after the initial shock has subsided. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable relationship between poverty, isolation, and mental illness. Was Sarah Jane born a monster, or was she created by her circumstances? The relentless hardship of her life, the failed farm, the constant hunger, the profound loneliness, cannot be ignored. These factors did not force her to kill her family, but they undoubtedly cultivated the ground in which her madness could take root. In an era with no social safety nets and no understanding of postpartum depression or severe psychosis, a woman like Sarah Jane had nowhere to turn. She was trapped, both physically on her remote farm and mentally within her deteriorating mind. Her story is a chilling example of what can happen when a fragile psyche is subjected to unbearable pressure without any hope of relief. It serves as a dark mirror to the pioneer spirit we so often romanticize. For every story of triumph over adversity on the American frontier, there are countless untold stories of despair, of minds and families broken by the sheer brutality of the struggle for survival. Sarah Jane's story is not just about a single, monstrous act. It's about the failure of a community and a society to see the signs of a soul in crisis until it was far, far too late. The horror of her crime is matched only by the tragedy of its inevitability. One of the most enduring mysteries of the case is the source of Sarah Jane's specific delusions. Why cannibalism? This act is one of humanity's oldest and most powerful taboos, a transgression against the very essence of civilization. Dr. Finch, in his notes, speculated on a number of possibilities. He wondered if it was a horrifyingly literal interpretation of the Christian Eucharist, a Last Supper of her own devising where she sought to absorb the purity of her children to save herself. Alternatively, he considered the influence of the local folklore. The stories of the taker in the woods, of ancient, hungry spirits, perhaps these tales, meant to scare children, had festered in her isolated mind and merged with her own religious mania. She may have come to believe that to save her children from the woods, she had to become the woods. She had to consume them to beat the monster at its own game. A third, more disturbing possibility is that the idea was entirely her own, a unique madness born from her specific circumstances. The gnawing, literal hunger she and her children experienced may have become pathologically intertwined with her spiritual hunger for salvation. In her broken logic, if feeding her children was her greatest challenge, then making them into the food that would save her soul was the ultimate, horrifying solution. We will never know for certain. The why behind her actions is buried with her in that unmarked asylum grave, leaving us to speculate on the precise nature of the thoughts that led to the pot on the hearth. The case of Sarah Jane Miller became a cautionary tale in the region, its details morphing and exaggerating over time. In some versions, she is a witch who made a pact with the devil. In others, she is a vengeful spirit who still haunts the woods of Breckinridge County, forever searching for more children to add to her stew. The historical facts have been subsumed by the more compelling power of folklore. The story serves as a boogeyman, a way to enforce social norms. It warns against isolation, against straying from the community and the church. It became a story told to frighten young brides into submission, a warning of what could happen to a woman who let melancholy take root. This transformation from true crime to folk tale is a common fate for such macabre histories. The reality is too complex, too psychologically messy. Folklore simplifies it, creating a clear monster and a clear moral. It's easier to believe in a witch than it is to confront the reality of a desperate, mentally ill mother. But in simplifying the story, we lose the most important lesson, that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. Sarah Jane Miller was not a witch or a demon. She was a woman, a wife, a mother. And it is that simple, undeniable fact that makes her story so profoundly and enduringly horrifying. The final details of this case reveal a lasting legacy of fear, a story that refuses to die. If you've made it this far, you're one of the few who can face the darkest chapters of history. Your curiosity is what keeps these forbidden stories alive. The legacy of the Miller family tragedy extends beyond folklore. It had a tangible impact on the community. For decades after, the term witch's cradle was spoken with a shudder. People avoided the area, and property values nearby plummeted. The story became a stain on the county's history, a source of shame and dark fascination. It also influenced, in a small way, the legal and medical treatment of the mentally ill in Kentucky. The trial, with its sensationalist coverage, brought the horrors of severe, untreated psychosis into the public eye. While the asylum system remained brutal for many years, cases like Sarah Jane's contributed to a slow-growing awareness that lunacy was a complex medical issue, not just a moral failing. It highlighted the need for institutions that could handle the criminally insane, separating them from the general prison population. Her case became a textbook example, studied by alienists and early psychiatrists, of how extreme environmental stress could trigger a catastrophic break from reality. She was, in a tragic sense, a pioneer, not of the frontier, but of the dark, uncharted territory of the human mind, a place whose exploration was just beginning. Her crimes were a brutal lesson, written in blood and bone, that the abstract horrors of the mind could have devastatingly real-world consequences. One detail that is often overlooked in the retelling of this story is the fate of the Miller cabin's contents. After Sarah Jane was committed, Sheriff Mullins had the unenviable task of clearing out the home. He burned most of it. The bedding, the clothes, the meager furniture. He piled it all in the yard and set it alight, as if trying to purge the evil with fire. But some items were kept as evidence or morbid curiosities. The rocking chair in which Sarah Jane was found was taken by one of the deputies and, according to local legend, brought bad luck to his family for years until they finally chopped it up for firewood. The cast-iron stew pot, the vessel of the central horror, is the subject of the most macabre lore. Its official fate is unknown. It was likely melted down or buried. But local legend claims it was stolen from the evidence locker by a collector of morbid artifacts. The story goes that the pot is still out there somewhere, a cursed object passed down through generations, its dark history unknown to its current owners. They say that food cooked in it always has a faint, unsettlingly sweet taste, and that those who eat from it are plagued by nightmares of a woman humming a lullaby in a dark cabin. It is almost certainly just a ghost story, but it speaks to our need to invest inanimate objects with the evil of the events they witnessed, as if the horror was so profound it had to soak into the very iron itself. Comparing Sarah Jane Miller's case to other historical instances of filicide and cannibalism reveals a unique psychological profile. Cases like the Donner Party were born of a clear, desperate survival instinct. Others, like the 20th century serial killer Albert Fish, were driven by violent psychosexual pathologies. Sarah Jane's case seems to fit neither category perfectly. Her actions were not driven by a need for physical survival. There was still some flour in the cabin, and neighbors like Abernathy would likely have helped had she asked. Nor was there any evidence of a sexual component to her crimes. Her motive was something else entirely, a twisted, quasi-religious and pathologically nurturing instinct. She killed not out of hatred, but out of a desire to protect. She cannibalized not out of hunger, but out of a desire for a sacred union. This makes her case particularly disturbing. It represents a complete inversion of the maternal instinct, turning the ultimate source of life and comfort into an agent of ritualistic death. She weaponized motherhood itself. This is why her story continues to shock and horrify in a way that others do not. It strikes at the very foundation of our trust in the natural order of the world, suggesting that even the most sacred bond, that of a mother and child, can be corrupted into an unthinkable nightmare. We must also consider the historical context of violence in post-war Kentucky. The state was awash with it. Years of brutal guerrilla warfare during the Civil War had left a deep scar on the collective psyche. Men who had seen and participated in unimaginable atrocities returned to their farms, often suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Life was cheap, and death was a familiar neighbor. While Sarah Jane's crimes were extreme, they occurred in a landscape where brutal violence was not an aberration. This does not excuse her actions, but it does provide a backdrop. The cheapness of life, the normalization of death, the ever-present threat of starvation, all these elements created an environment where the unthinkable could become possible. Sarah Jane's mind, already fragile, was marinating in this culture of death and desperation. When her own private world began to collapse, the violence she turned to was not alien to the world outside her cabin door. It was just a more intimate, more taboo version of the brutality that defined her era. Her specific madness was her own, but the general climate of violence and despair was a burden shared by many. She was simply the one who broke in the most spectacular and horrifying way imaginable. But something like this happened today. It is a question that naturally arises from such a story. We have social services, a better understanding of mental health, and communities that are, for the most part, far less isolated. A woman like Sarah Jane today might be identified as being at risk. Postpartum depression might be diagnosed. A call to child protective services might be made. And yet, cases of extreme domestic horror continue to occur, even in our modern, interconnected world. The core elements of her story, mental illness, isolation, and extreme stress, are timeless. While the specific manifestation of her psychosis was shaped by her 19th century world, the underlying potential for a human mind to break from reality is a permanent part of the human condition. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that the safeguards of civilization are a recent and fragile invention. Pushed far enough, stripped of support, and lost in the labyrinth of their own mind, a person can become capable of anything. The particulars of the Miller case are a product of their time, but the darkness they represent is eternal. It is the darkness that whispers to us from the forbidden corners of history, reminding us of the thinness of the veneer that separates order from chaos, love from annihilation. In the end, we are left with more questions than answers. The full truth of what happened in that cabin died with Sarah Jane Miller. We have the facts, the bodies, the bones, the confession, but we lack the emotional and psychological truth. We can never know what it felt like to be her, to hear the whispers she heard, to believe that salvation lay in a simmering pot. We are left to look back through the cloudy lens of history, at a crime that has become encrusted with layers of myth and speculation. The story has become a vessel for our own fears. Our fear of madness, our fear of isolation, our fear of the dark, and our deepest, most primal fear of the people we are supposed to be able to trust the most. It is a true cold case, not because the perpetrator is unknown, but because the motive, the true why, remains tantalizingly and terrifyingly out of reach. It has been over 150 years since Sarah Jane Miller cooked her children into a stew, but the chill of her story has not faded. It lingers because it is a story about the ultimate betrayal, the ultimate perversion of nature, an act so fundamentally wrong it feels as though it should have cracked the sky open. Revisiting the scene at the beginning of our story, we see Sheriff Mullen standing in the doorway of that silent cabin. The scene is now imbued with all the horrifying knowledge we have since gained. We can almost see the ghosts of the preceding days. Thomas Miller's last desperate argument, the cold, efficient murder in the night, the two small children playing, unaware, in the shadow of their mother's escalating madness. We can imagine the chillingly tender moment of the poisoning, and the long, terrible night of butchery that followed. The bubbling pot on the hearth is no longer just a strange detail. It is the monstrous centerpiece of a fallen world, the altar of a horrifying new religion. And Sarah Jane, sitting in her rocking chair, is no longer just a vacant woman. She is a figure of immense and terrifying power, a high priestess who has completed her sacrament and is now at peace, bathed in the afterglow of a successful ritual. The sheriff, in that moment, stood at the precipice of a darkness he could never have imagined existed. He was a man of law and order, of simple rights and wrongs, and he had stumbled into a place where all those rules had been systematically and horrifically dismantled. The smell in the air was not just the smell of cooking meat. It was the smell of sanity's absolute collapse. The tale of Sarah Jane Miller serves as a stark and brutal reminder that the deepest horrors are not found in fiction, but are etched into the forgotten corners of our own history. It's a story that defies easy explanation, leaving us in a state of profound unease. It collapses the distance between past and present, showing us a darkness within human nature that is both ancient and ever-present. The ghosts of Samuel and Martha Miller and their father Thomas do not haunt the woods of Breckinridge County. They haunt the narrative itself, their silence screaming across the decades. And the ghost of their mother, Sarah Jane, serves as the ultimate cautionary figure, a testament to the terrifying places the human mind can go when it is left alone in the dark. Her actions were a final, desperate attempt to exert control over a life of utter powerlessness, a horrifying declaration of sovereignty over the bodies and souls of her own family. There is no redemption in this story, no comforting moral to be found. There is only the cold, hard fact of what happened, and the chilling, unanswerable question that will forever hang over the cursed soil of Witch's Cradle. Why?